So it's part 2 of lesson 10. I've uploaded what we've done so far. Not that there's much code in it that I've written, but it is on GitHub if you need it. So let's start to play around a little bit. Let's do maybe a couple things. First, we'll go to our artist component. We can actually use some styles. So I think what we'll do here is let's go to the app.component.html. We can copy all of the styles out of here, and we can put them we have a global style sheet, styles.css. So what I'm going to do is if you open up the app.component.html file, from line 10, I'm just going to close that whole style section, and then I'm just going to copy it. Okay, so from line 10 all the way down to line 303. Rather than highlighting all of them, you can just expand or contract it in your code editor, copy the whole thing, and then down here in the root of the app, we've got styles.css, which is an empty style sheet. I'm going to paste all of it in here, and then I can remove, I've got a closing HTML style tag at the bottom, and then it starts with an HTML style tag. Just get rid of those. So now I've got all of the styles from Angular here, and we can use some of these. So I'll save my style sheet. And then we'll need to link this style sheet into our index.html. So I'll go here. And so I'm just going to add that style sheet in. And then we can actually use some of the styles, in our artist page. We go back here and so maybe here, my style sheet for a minute, we've got this card highlight card. I'm going to apply that class maybe. Card space highlight card. We'll see if that restyles, and then we can actually change this heading. I'll change the heading to say, I don't know, featured artists. So now it's using that class. Could change the font if we like, but now we've got kind of a global style sheet. And maybe I'll change this to a heading. Shouldn't be a paragraph, it should be a H1 is probably semantically more correct HTML. So let's look now at how would we define, and we want to define an artist in the component and then render it in our HTML view with Angular syntax. So I'm going to go back to the component here. And we'll define some properties of an artist. let's see, we're going to do this up here. Create a model style template to define an artist object. And in here, we'll set up two properties, an ID, that's a number. So here's our typing. Right? It's kind of like our Mongoose schema. So Mongoose supports typing, TypeScript supports typing, but plain old JavaScript, it doesn't support it, strong typing. And then we also had an artist name, which is a string. Whoops, sorry, this should be. So now inside of the component, we can define we'll define an artist of type artist, ID 1, name, I don't know, put in any artist you like. So I'll save this. Okay, it doesn't like this. Oh, it wants. Okay, so I needed to use my code hint to say it's a string or it's undefined. And then we've defined an artist. We should be able to now render this artist in our HTML. We'll try it out. So now we should be able to reference the artist. It recognizes that class, and we can reference the name or the ID. So now in my browser, my artist name shows up. Now this is just a simple example. We actually want to create a list of artists in the Angular component and render them with a loop. So we're going to kind of undo some of this. Okay, so we've defined a class, we've instantiated and populated an object here, and then we have access to it in the front end, again, using our handlebar syntax that's familiar. So instead of actually defining a single artist, we'll create a list of artist objects. So I'm just going to modify this a bit. We're going to make this an array instead. So we're going to make an array instead. So go ahead and add any artist that you like. You don't have to add the same ones that I do. Oops, should be a colon. It's nice my code editor is catching these errors. Okay, it doesn't want me to use const. Okay, I think I may just want it this way. So now instead of a single artist, I've got an array of type artist. Now it says it's unused. That's okay. Not going to worry about that. So now we're going to modify our front end to use a loop instead. Instead of, now it crashes. So sorry, I put this in the wrong place. I'm sorry, I defined this in the wrong place. My apologies. This has to go outside of our class. Outside of our component, we're going to define it up here. I'm sorry. And this now I should be able to use. Now we will make list available to the view. Sorry about that. So we're creating our list up here, and then we're defining an artist's property of our component, and we're filling it from our array. Now, this is still going to cause an error in the browser. And it says artist no longer exists. Did you mean artists? So we did, but we're going to need a loop because we've got 3 of them. So we'll go back here. And I could change it to artists, but we still have an issue here. So we're going to need a loop for this now. Let's take this out. We'll create a section. And then we can use an Angular loop structure. Use a div. And if I use star, we can use an Angular directive that's ng4. Let A of artists. And I'll also use a card class for this. So now we want to display the artist name. In a loop. I'll save that. And now I get 3 cards, and the artist name shows up in each one. If I were to go and change my data set, my list will automatically refresh. So maybe let's say I add as soon as I hit Control S in my code editor, our app should restart and reload. Hit Control S. And automatically my next card shows up. So we can define the data in the component. make that data a property of the component, and then we have access to it in our front end. Not quite sure it's not recognizing my Angular loop. I won't worry too much about it. Sorry. Yes, thank you, Adam. I didn't have the chat open. Thank you. You debugged it for me, as you are so good at doing. So now the other thing I want to add one more thing here, which is a form. So we want a form on this page. So if I click on an artist, it will populate the ID and name into the form. And then if I change the form values, it will also update the cards automatically. So we can see this two-way data binding. So we're going to make a simple form down below. We don't actually even need an HTML form tag, which is sort of cool. So we'll put on an H2, maybe it'll say details. And we'll put on 2 field sets, keep it simple. Label. Say ID. And then we'll have an input. And we're going to use the ng Model Directive. And we're going to change the, actually, well, we'll leave it out. Sorry, I'll leave out the ng model first. We'll just put on the inputs. We don't actually even need a button. So here's what it looks like now. We've got a form. So what we want is when we click on any artist, it will automatically populate the ID and name into the form. We could also clean up our form. We could make these labels the same width, for example. So we could just define a class for that. Maybe in our label, we'll give it a class of LBL, which we will define in our style sheet. So if we define this LBL class, we can set a standard width. And that way these will align nicely. We're not using Bootstrap, so we don't have the kind of grid system. I'll go back to my style sheet. I'll scroll all the way to the bottom. .lbl, we'll set the width at 75 pixels. We also might need display inline block. There. So now you can see my boxes are now aligned because each label is exactly the same width. We could also get rid of these borders on our field sets. So if I define field set, say border, none. When I save, that gets wiped out as well. Okay, these things aren't critical to working with Angular, but if we're going to do it, we may as well clean it up, make it look good. I also want to change this font. I think the font is terrible. So at the very top, I think we can define, we've got a host. I'll also add comma body. There. So it now applies this to the body as well. It's Apple system font. It's kind of the default font the Angular template's using. So I just added comma body here. So now what we need to do is we need to add some code in the component as well as into our form. So if I click on one of these, it will select that artist and then populate the form without a reload with the artist ID and name. So we're going to go back to our component and set that up first. So in our component, we'll need to set up a property here. So we've already got an artist property. We're going to select a specific artist when clicked in the list. So we'll say selected artist. We'll define a property, and it is of type artist. So it's a singular. It says it's unused. And then we can write a little method here. We want to populate selected artist when clicked. So we'll create a method called onSelect that takes in an artist object. And then we'll set our selected artist equal. And this should return void. So in TypeScript, our return type is defined at the end of a method rather than before the method name. Okay, so we're defining a property here. I guess we need to add this undefined. Oops, hang on, sorry. It's a little unclear. We'll do it this way. So we're declaring it, but we're not populating it. The selected artist property gets defined when somebody clicks on an artist. And so we're adding the selected artist property, and we're adding the onSelect method. Now, if I save those changes, we're not going to see anything different in our, nothing updates here. So now we need to code the HTML to call the select method when we click, and then also to populate our form whenever we click on an artist. And actually, we'll do a little more HTML here as well. So we're going to add an Angular click event to our artist. When you click on an artist, something should happen. So we could add it. We'll add it actually to this element. We'll add, you see, here are the Angular click events, right? They're all in round brackets. So click, what we want to do is call onSelect, and we pass in our artist variable. When you click one of these artists, we're going to call that method, which is then going to populate our selected artist property. The other thing I'm going to do, it's not clear that these are actually links. So we'll actually see what happens if we there may be a better way of doing it. We have to give it an empty. There, at least they look like links now. Okay, so I've just wrapped kind of a dead anchor tag around the artist name. So now in our inputs, we can define an ng model. So it's now going to be our selected artist dot ID. So that's going to be the model for our first input. Our second text box will be the selected artist dot name. Okay, so now notice this. Okay. The issue is now our form, it's undefined because when our form first loads, we don't have a selected artist. So this crashes. So we need to make one more change, at least one more. This whole section should be hidden if there is no selected artist. Because right now we have no selected artist, so this is going to die. So we're going to use ng if selected artist. So we're only showing the form if the user has clicked one of the artists. That was interesting. Hang on, let me save that change again. May need a little tweak. Can bind since it isn't a known property of the input. Okay, let's figure that out. What's going on here? So if we have a selected artist, show the form. I'm just going to take out the ng models for a minute. Didn't quite expect that result. That's okay. We'll figure it out. Okay, so when the form first loads, it's okay like this. And it does load the form, so that's good. So what's up with our ng model? I'll figure it out. I think that's what we had before. I didn't like this very much. Can't bind. I know what we're missing. We're missing a reference. It's not provided by any applicable directives. What the heck does that mean? The problem is here. Our code was actually fine, but in appmodule.ts, we need to include the forms, Angular forms dependency. I forgot that part. So we need to import, help if I read my own notes. It's forms module. We need to import the forms module, and it needs to be declared down here. Without this dependency, we can't bind to our inputs using the ng model decorator. So we need to import the forms module and add it to the list of imports. So now when I click any artist, it populates the form. So now I should be able to go back and add my ng model here as well. So by default, we get our list as soon as we click something. So our form is populating. Notice the page is not reloading at all. Right? Angular is keeping them in sync. As soon as I click an artist, it sets the selected artist property, and our form is always bound to the selected artist. Now here's the cool part. If I pick an artist, remember this data binding, when I use ng model, it's not just one way. So right now our form is being bound to the model, right? The model is populating the view. So when I click something, it sets the model, and the form is tied to the model. But the data binding goes the other way as well. If I change something in the view, it will update the model. Okay, Chris, give me 1 second and I'm going to do that. So if I do this, notice as I type, look at what happens to the card. Right? Here's our two-way data binding. So when I choose an artist, my form populates, but my form also is synced to the model at the same time. So they're all Angular keeps them in sync. It's a continuous, it's called single source of truth. So my view and my data, they're always in sync. Now we're almost done with this, just a couple quick things more we want to do. I have no way. Yeah, I think it's very cool. What if I want to clear the form though? Right? I've got no way to do this. So we should have like a reset button that will set selected artist back to null and hide our form. The form will get hidden automatically, right? Because if there is no selected artist, the form is not visible. So we want a little reset on here. And then, Chris, yes, I'll add that CSS. So down here at the bottom, let's add a button. We'll add an Angular click handler. So when we click it, we'll call onSelect, but this time we're going to pass in null. The button can say hide/reset. So we're going to clear out the selected artist property when we click reset. This should wipe out our text boxes, and it should also hide this entire section. except that didn't work. So we may have to. Okay, doesn't like us assigning null. Let's see if we can do this. No, I don't like that either. Okay, we'll write a new method. That's okay. We'll write a clear artist method. So when we click, we'll try to clear the artist. See if we can null it out here. We can set it to undefined. Okay, thanks, Adam. Sure, why not? Okay, so we can navigate around, We hide, and it's gone. Click again, comes back. So we can style our button. And then Chris, you suggested giving the section class for the Angular loop card container. Yeah, let's do that. And then we'll also style our button. I think we'll call it a day. So in our section here, you used card container. Sure. Oh yeah, definitely, much better. Yeah, very cool. And now we could just style our button a bit. I think there's actually, we'll just define a button class. I've got one here. We'll add this definition to our style sheet and then apply it to our button. So go back to my style sheet. They might even have a button here somewhere. They probably do. But we'll just define a class called BTN. I'm using that blue color from the header. And then I'll apply that class here. We'll give the button a class. But be class. So now it kind of looks like the button. Right, so we hide. We can change stuff. And it updates in real time. So we don't even need like a submit button. We don't need a database. We don't even need a form tag or name attributes on these elements. We're using the ng model for binding them instead. And our two-way data binding kind of keeps this synchronization between our data and our view going. Okay, so there's our sort of simple Angular app. will start to give you a flavor of how Angular works. So next week, the next 2 weeks, our goal with this is to rebuild our NodeTunes library, but we're going to build it as a single page app so that we can create, read, update, and delete artists all on one page. And we'll use Angular so that that page will never need to refresh. The data will always be current. So if we add an artist, it'll simply get added to the list automatically. We don't have to do a redirect or a reload. So we're going to use some of what we've already created. We'll basically build our app into two pieces: a server end with Node and Express, and we're going to get rid of the HBS templating, and we're going to use Angular as our client app, our front end. Okay, so the Angular app will actually go inside of the Node app to give you an idea of what the structure will look like eventually. I can give you a preview. Maybe. Bear with me for a moment. I think I have an example I can show. Oh. Maybe not. I thought I did. Ah, okay. Something like eventually, our structure will look something like this. This is an old one. So in our server, we're going to have our controllers and models. So our Node and Express backend goes here. And then the client will hold the Angular app with our components, services, etc. Okay, so the Angular app will live inside of the same project, basically, is where we're going. It'll take us a couple of weeks to build. We'll kind of build it in pieces. And then so looking at where we're going over the next few weeks, we're going to build our single page app. And then we're going to look at requiring authentication in the Node and Express API in the backend using JWT. So this is where we're going over our last few classes. So for today, there's no homework. We've already done the lab. So actually, let me just remove that. The lab was due last week. So do two things. Play around a bit with Angular. You may want to explore that LinkedIn Learning tutorial. And other than that, you're working on assignment 3, but you still have 2 weeks to do. Does anybody have questions? Any questions? Yeah, it is. It takes a little while to harness the power, but it is cool. Okay. All right, everybody. Well, you're free to go. If you have questions, feel free to send me an email. I also added some office hours times on Friday, if needed, because I've got to go to the dentist tomorrow instead of having office hours. Yes, have yourselves a great week. I'll see you next week.